Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Setsuka, who is the MLDB or Moonlight Dreamblade artifact character who has finally been released. With this, today we'll break down her skills, her builds, her PvP and PvE usage alongside pros and cons. But ultimately, guys, keep in mind that today is just a first impressions, and although I have actually played quite a bit with her already, I do have some initial thoughts and some findings about her that I do think make her maybe interesting, but not necessarily as OP as you may think. Without further ado though, let's get into it. So first and foremost, Setsuka is a fire thief who has pretty good scaling in terms of stats. She isn't super speed focused, which makes sense once we get to her skills, but overall she's able to have pretty high HP. She can have decently high attack too, honestly, if you look for it, but otherwise she doesn't really have that much effectiveness or effect resistance, which is fine. Now, in terms of her actual skills though, let's start with her skill 2. Now, her skill 2 gives evasion to the entire team, and when an ally, except for the caster evades, you counterattack. Now, after you counterattack, when your fighting spirit is full, you can then consume all this, kind of similar to that of a, I guess, like a Benimaru or an Abyssal Euphine, and then you activate a special passive or a special ability. In this case, this is Demon Blade Unleashed, and this is a huge AoE attack, or rather, I guess it grants you this buff, Demon Blade Unleashed, before unleashing Blade Art Bewitching Blossom, and this is the actual attack that gives you buffs, deals an insane amount of damage, consumes your HP, and also gives you combat readiness push. Now, this also scales specifically off of how much health that you've lost, which does incentivize you to build HP. But let's move now to her skill 3, which will make most of her kit honestly make more sense. Now, her skill 3, and the reason why she's able to kind of make this whole evasion playstyle viable, even without necessarily needing to have a full team of evasion characters, is because not only does she dispel the entire, or rather dispel all buffs from enemies while inflicting beguile, it also applies blind, which is obviously insanely annoying. Now, to add to this, you are able to ignore the effect resistance of any targets that have less health than you, and that's obviously going to be pretty big, and also part of the reason why you'll probably want to build her with high HP. But to add to this, then we have her skill 1, which is not only a honestly okay, but maybe not the most insane damage dealing hit, but this is also the primary way that you'll generate fighting spirit. Now, in terms of her build, as you can see here, the main focus that I have, at least, or I've seen not just myself but many others use currently, is to have her on some sort of HP focused build. Whether you choose to have HP as her secondary set, whether you choose to have counter as her primary 4-piece set, these are all kind of up in the air right now. There are certain situations where one are better than the other, and of course this will probably come down to your playstyle and what your goals are. That said, in terms of actual play, I found that not having Destro can kind of feel a little bit odd, as again, sometimes you'll need to take Setsuka as an anchor, or you might use Setsuka against a team that is primarily tankier or going to be more Knight or Soul Weaver based, and therefore if you don't have this level of tankiness, you kind of aren't able to apply the beguile, and if you aren't able to apply the beguile and the hit chance, apologies, you aren't actually able to do anything with their skill 3, which, not to say you necessarily always need to use their skill 3, especially if you have characters like Flan on your team, but if you do want to pick Setsuka as a more generally accessible character, regardless of what the enemy team has, you will need a bit of HP, as you're obviously seeing right now. Now, in terms of builds, I do also want to say that for her artifact does feel unironically kind of necessary. Now, I know a lot of players may find this whole after doing X you have a % chance to activate a skill once more to be a bit gimmicky or inconsistent, which is why players may end up choosing something like Proof of Valor, or like some effect resistance artifact, well, maybe not in Setsuka's case, but some other AoE damage dealing effect, or maybe something with evasion like Shepherd of the Hollow instead of Setsuka's artifact. However, as we'll get into in a moment, because you do actually need a full fighting spirit bar, and if I'm not mistaken you need 100% or 100 or essentially 10 basic attacks in order for this thing to fill, it's actually quite important for you to have this artifact so that you can activate your basic attack skills once more. Now, To be clear, you could obviously run something like another evasion artifact. You could also give yourself something like, again, Sword of Summer Twilight if you don't care for the evasion, Double-Edged the Crescent if you think they're going to hit you. All these other artifacts are obviously possible or viable. However, if you're trying to use her as someone that is a turn 2 or rather more like a reverse cleave type character, it definitely feels like you'll need this artifact specifically. Oh, I had equipped it. Or it feels like you'll need some sort of artifact like Double-Edged the Crescent, among others, including maybe something like Proof of Valor if you're afraid of getting one shot, or if you end up running her on something like Counter Set. Now, with that, I've obviously talked a little bit about her viability in PvP, or the way that you might approach her in PvP, but let's take a moment to think about where she could be viable in, well, PvE. Now, I will admit, since they got rid of Nightmare Raid, basically they've streamlined the PvE viable characters to about, I don't know, maybe like 12 of the most used characters you've ever seen. And this includes characters like Sirmia, this includes characters like Fenris, this includes basically just the hunt characters and whatever they decide to throw or force you into using for the Rift for the week or for the month or for the period. However, although this is all possible, you do technically have a bit of open-endedness in terms of what the potential for Trial of the Constellations will bring, and this, alongside Hall of Trials, sometimes forcing you to use certain characters, could technically offer some viability or add some usage for characters, especially like Setsuka, and honestly kind of similar to a lot of the modern era gacha games where they create content specifically to shill out a new character. This could be a scenario where Setsuka or future characters even could be placed in Hall of Trials if you want a good score, but ultimately, as many players probably know, it doesn't take an absolute perfect score to get the resources that you need. So in terms of PvE, we can maybe gloss over this a little bit. I don't think many people are even farming for something like Golem, and even if you were, there's definitely someone better than Setsuka. Now, in terms of RTA, I definitely have also tried her quite a bit. In Arena, I think it might be a little bit more difficult to play around, just because, again, you aren't able to force certain pre-bans out. But as you can see here, I've had a little bit of success in terms of the way that I'll play her. This in particular was actually a game that I found to be the most comfortable around Setsuka, and this was when I was able to put a forcible or a character that you have to hit in front of her or before her, and then as you can see, these enemies enemies on the right side kind of weren't able to deal with all of the skill nullifiers from the Litica. They weren't able to utilize or really able to one-shot my Arunka, and I'll explain that more in a bit. But even as you'll see later, as I tried to play a bit more around Setsuka, there are obviously certain compositions that will just one-shot you, or it feels like you can't play around. And although, again, I definitely tried her for a little bit and had mixed results, I do want to say that Setsuka herself is definitely not the sort of character that is likely a first pick type character. However, if you are afraid of getting anti-cleaved immediately, I actually find that this may be a character that cleavers may actually have to take or use a bit early, as I don't really know what a great answer to basically a character who's like Fat Cat and can make you already get punished from minute 1 if you already know that you're fighting against a cleaver. If you are able to pivot as a cleaver, then great, fantastic. I'm sure there are clear ways to counter or deal with the Setsuka first pick, but for all of the cases, although I don't think that Setsuka is a first pick type character, I do actually, or had actually found that if I didn't pick her, there was a chance that someone would take something, again, like the new kid Aiden alongside Setsuka, and then I was basically dead as a cleaver. Now, of course, there are plenty of other ways that I think you could play the Setsuka. You could obviously try and play her slower, but I actually did enjoy the idea of her as a slower type character who could kind of one-shot or AoE after the entire team has died. I do also think, however, that in most cases, if there isn't someone that can cleanse, it's basically a free win for the Setsuka. Now, that said, if there was a cleanser, and this is usually the case, especially with characters like Lady of the Scales Mercedes around, it did feel a bit more difficult to play around her. And honestly, even with characters like Fallen Cecilia throwing around or being thrown around alongside the Ilanov, it doesn't make her the easiest character ever to play. That said, I do think that there are pretty obvious pros and cons to Setsuka, even from my initial testing, and really here are my thoughts on the following. Now, in terms of her obvious pros, Yes, it does feel extremely annoying to have a character who can effectively beguile and blind the entire enemy team, especially if you have a decent amount of health or are pretty survivable on your team. If they're blinded and if this buff goes off and there's no cleanse on the enemy team, which again is quite rare. However, like if this is the case, it's basically a GG. Setsuka will inevitably get out her abilities, and although 40% chance with her artifact is not insanely high, just having this go on and off and on and off just basically means that you've won the game almost like easily, almost like immediately. That said, in terms of the other strengths, I do want to say that obviously she is quite tanky. Her stats are quite nice. She doesn't have any free stats like some of the other characters, which I think may have been cool. And although you may argue that the free 200% attack is quite, significant, I honestly think that Demon Blade Unleashed is not the most insane buff ever. This really doesn't feel like the Euphine, like a skill 3 passive buff, where it feels like you become unkillable. However, if you aren't able to get off the S3, the main reason why I feel that actually Setsuka's kit is so strong is not just because you get this attack off and you're able to get like 200% attack and you can't die, but I actually think that by the time that you've probably gotten her S2 off, the entire enemy team has probably been beguiled a couple of turns. They're blind and like they've taken a number of skill 1 attacks from Setsuka, and that instantly in most cases brings them down to at least like the 10% or like 15% HP range. And again, this was, as you saw, like I used this against a couple different variations. I used this against Ilanov, I used this against Fallen Cecilia, and the damage was pretty impressive. But despite all this, she obviously has some cons. Now, for me, I think the most obvious cons for Setsuka is the fact that, well, you do kind of need some sort of evasion unit if there's going to be a cleanser or an anti-evasion type character on the enemy team. Now, of course, if they just bring someone like the Last Piece Karen, or if they end up taking someone like Briarwitch Iseria with Symbol of Unity, of course, guys, like there is nothing that you can do about this with Setsuka, and that's in my opinion, the most obvious weakness for Setsuka. If someone ends up taking someone like Death de la Rey or characters that make it impossible for them to miss, well, then you're kind of out of luck. However, I do think that one of the shining reasons for why Setsuka can be used, though it is kind of also a con, is her element. Now, one of the things that you might have seen is I took her into Mort, and although that specific matchup did not feel great, obviously because you can't counter against a Mort, I do actually think that there is a chance for Setsuka to counter many of the green units that you'll find flying around. Now, obviously, this is pretty limited to characters like the young Senya, alongside things like maybe the Yolha, apologies, alongside Alencia, but obviously these are a bit more niche characters and not necessarily characters that you'll see in every single match. Now, the other side of that is obviously if you end up fighting against some of the water units in the game, including characters obviously like the Elena, if you end up fighting characters like even Elvira, to be honest, alongside Crow, this character does feel a little bit weaker, as you can obviously get Uno reverse cleaved through some of these other characters, but obviously I think these are not as common picks as people just slamming all the ML5s in the game right now, as most of the ML5s are just broken. That's going to be it for today's video though, guys. If you're curious about whether or not the character is worth pulling for, I'd honestly argue that, well, she's not a limited, and since really the true limiteds of epicseven are the collaboration units, which again, we don't even know if those are necessarily limited since we have the class summons of characters or of character artifacts at least. It doesn't necessarily feel like any character is a must pull any day or any time or as of late. But I will say that in terms of how fun she is, and honestly in terms of design, fantastic. Huge amounts of honestly let me rephrase that, endless amounts of fun. I've definitely put a number of games into her, and I think if you're a cleaver, you may find her as a decent anchor, especially if you have access to other characters like the new kid Aiden, if you have characters like the Flan, or honestly even characters like the Savior Aiden. That's going to be it for today's video though, guys. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.